The rain had just stopped, leaving the streets glistening under the golden wash of early evening light. Across the wide windows of a towering glass skyscraper, the reflection of the city shimmered like a fractured dream. Inside that building, in the corner office on the top floor, sat Richard Langston, billionaire, magnate, a man who believed he had conquered the world. His empire stretched across continents, his name whispered in boardrooms and etched into skyscrapers. And yet behind the leather chair, the polished oak desk, and the endless string of accolades, there was a hollow space in him that no amount of wealth could ever fill. That emptiness was shaped like his daughter, Amelia, who had vanished without a trace 10 years earlier. Amelia had been his joy, his pride, the one person who softened the steel edges of his heart. When she disappeared, his world cracked. He poured millions into private investigators, police searches, and international inquiries. Every lead turned cold. Every hope ended in ashes. Over the years, the grief hardened him, sharpening his obsession with control. The world knew him as ruthless, decisive, untouchable. But beneath it all, he was still a father clawing at shadows. That evening, his driver insisted he wait inside while the car was brought around. But Richard stepped out onto the pavement. He liked the city after rain, the way it seemed to breathe, the way it masked his own restless thoughts. He adjusted his tailored coat and scanned the street. And then his heart stopped. Across the avenue, bent over a mop bucket in front of a small grocery store, was a young black woman. The fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow over her, but even from a distance, her face struck him like lightning. Her eyes, her cheekbones, the curve of her jaw, it was Amelia. Not just a resemblance, not just a passing likeness, but the very image of the daughter he had lost. His chest tightened. The air left his lungs. For a moment, he thought time itself had broken open, returning what the world had stolen from him. He stepped closer, his polished shoes splashing through shallow puddles. The woman looked up, startled by the looming figure. Her eyes met his, brown, wide, cautious, and Richard's entire body trembled. It wasn't Amelia. Her skin was darker, her frame slightly stronger, her hair braided neatly beneath a worn headscarf. And yet the resemblance was undeniable. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice cracking in a way it hadn't in years. "What is your name?" The young woman straightened, gripping the mop handle like a shield. She studied him carefully before answering. "Danielle," she said slowly. "Danielle." The sound of it didn't match Amelia, but her eyes, God, her eyes pulled him into the past. You look exactly like someone I once knew," Richard whispered. "Like my daughter." Danielle frowned, suspicion hardening her features. Men like him didn't usually speak to women like her. Not in this part of town. Not with such intensity. She had grown used to being invisible to the wealthy, a background figure expected to clean and step aside. And now here was a billionaire trembling before her like a lost child. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, returning her gaze to the floor. "You must be mistaken." But Richard couldn't move. He couldn't let go. Something deeper than coincidence pressed against his chest, urging him to understand why fate had led him here. The following night, Richard returned. Danielle was there again, wiping down windows this time. She ignored him, but he watched her every gesture, every expression, searching for the ghost of Amelia in her movements. And when she finally confronted him, her patience gone, her words were sharp. "Why are you watching me?"
Do you think because you're...
"Rich, you can stand there and stare at people while they work?" Her voice was strong, steady. It cut through him, both accusing and alive with dignity. He raised his hands in surrender. "I don't mean any harm. It's just, you remind me of someone. My daughter. She disappeared years ago. And when I see you, it feels like she's here again." Danielle's expression softened slightly, though distrust still clouded her eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I'm not her. I've lived here my whole life. I mop floors, I clean offices, I take care of my little brother. That's who I am." Her words struck him harder than she knew. The simplicity of her life, the resilience it carried, clashed with the gilded cage he had built for Amelia. His daughter had grown up with privilege, security, everything money could buy. Yet in Danielle's voice was a strength Amelia had never been allowed to develop. Still, he couldn't shake it. He hired private investigators to look into Danielle's past. They told him she was born in the same city, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs. Her father was never in the picture. Nothing unusual, nothing that linked her to him. And yet, the resemblance was so powerful it haunted him day and night. Richard began to visit the grocery store more often, sometimes leaving large tips or offering help. though Danielle always refused his charity. "I don't need your money," she told him. "I need respect." That sentence sliced him open. Respect was something he had demanded all his life, but rarely given freely. And here was a young black woman, standing in her work uniform, commanding it with more power than any boardroom executive he had ever faced. Weeks passed, and the fragile thread between them deepened. Danielle began to share pieces of her life, her struggles, her dreams, her pride in holding her family together despite the odds. Richard, for the first time in decades, found himself listening, not as a billionaire, not as a man of power, but as a human being. And then one evening, everything shifted. Richard's investigator returned with new information, his face pale. "Sir," he said carefully, "there's something you need to see." He placed an envelope on the desk. Inside were records, birth certificates, adoption papers, and hospital files. Richard's hands shook as he unfolded them. The dates aligned. The names overlapped. A truth long buried rose to the surface. Danielle wasn't just a stranger who resembled his daughter. She was Amelia's sister. Years ago, before Richard had built his empire, before the world knew his name, there had been another life, another relationship. He had been reckless, selfish, driven by ambition. And in that recklessness, he had fathered a child he never acknowledged. A child who grew up without him. A child who had been forced to carry the weight of his absence. Danielle. The room spun. His breath caught in his throat. He realized in that moment that his missing daughter had been a wound. But Danielle was the scar he had never bothered to see. She carried his blood, his legacy, yet none of his love, none of his protection. And now she stood before him, strong despite his neglect, dignified despite his silence. The discovery did not just shake him, it destroyed him. Richard could not sleep that night. He sat in the dark corner of his mansion, the quiet halls echoing with memories he had long buried. Danielle's face haunted him, not just because of the resemblance to Amelia, but because of what it revealed about himself. The empire he built, the life of power he flaunted, all stood on a foundation of abandonment. He had left behind a child, knowingly or not, and that child had grown up invisible to him, invisible yet unbreakable. The next morning, Richard drove himself for the first time in years, abandoning the chauffeur, abandoning protocol. He parked across from the grocery store and waited until Danielle stepped outside to take a break. She wore her work apron, wiping her hands on a towel, her expression tired yet composed. When she saw him, her eyes narrowed. "You again?" she said. "Please," Richard begged, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "I need to speak with you. Not about the resemblance, not about money, about the truth." Danielle hesitated. The sincerity in his tone unsettled her. Finally, she crossed her arms and nodded. 5 minutes. Then I go back to work." Richard's hands shook as he pulled the envelope of documents from his coat. He handed it to her, his throat dry. She looked down at the papers, confused at first, then frozen as the reality unfolded before her eyes. Birth certificates, records, her mother's name. A signature she recognized, though she had never known what it meant. Her breath caught. She looked up at him with fury and disbelief. "What is this supposed to mean?" "It means," Richard whispered, "that I am your father." The world seemed to tilt. Danielle's jaw tightened, her eyes blazing. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to walk into my life, wave some papers around and call yourself my father." Richard nodded, shame weighing down every word. "You're right. I don't deserve it. I don't deserve anything from you. But it is the truth, and I cannot run from it anymore." Danielle's chest rose and fell, anger mixing with years of unanswered questions. She thought of her mother, tired, broken, always working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. She thought of her little brother, the nights she had gone hungry so he could eat. She thought of the silence her mother carried whenever Danielle asked about her father. That silence now had a face, a name, a billionaire standing on the sidewalk with regret carved into his eyes. "Do you know what it was like?" Danielle's voice cracked, but her words were sharp. "Do you know what it's like to grow up without a father? To watch your mother break her back for years, while you live in a palace, while you let the world praise you? Do you know the shame, the hunger, the nights I cried because I wanted to know why I wasn't good enough to be claimed?" Richard bowed his head. "I can only imagine, and that is my sin. I was blinded by ambition. I thought power would make me invincible, but it only made me cowardly. I failed you, and nothing I do will ever erase that." Danielle's eyes welled, but she refused to let tears fall. She refused to give him the satisfaction of absolution. "Then why are you here? What do you want from me now? Richard took a trembling breath. I don't want anything. I came because I need to face what I did. And because I need you to know you were never unworthy. You were never invisible. I see you now, and I am destroyed by the truth that I did not see you sooner. The silence between them was heavy, stretched taut by decades of pain. People passed by on the street. Unaware of the storm brewing in that small corner of the city, Danielle closed the envelope, pressing it against her chest as though it burned. You don't get to fix this with apologies, she said. You don't get to step in and play savior now. My life is mine. My dignity is mine. You weren't there when I needed a father. You can't just become one because you finally feel guilty. Her words were final, resolute. They were not meant to heal him. They were meant to protect her. Richard nodded, tears streaking his cheeks. For the first time in his life, he let them fall freely, without shame, without pretense. I understand. All I can ask is, if you'll allow me, I want to support you. Not as a father, not as a benefactor, just as a man trying to make right what he made wrong. Danielle studied him for a long moment. She saw the cracks in his armor, the collapse of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. And though her heart raged with pain, there was also a sliver of something else, a recognition of power reversed. For once, she was the one in control. You want to make it right? She said finally. Then use that wealth, that empire, not to drown me in gifts, but to lift others like me, the children who grow up forgotten, the mothers who break their bodies for survival, the workers you pass on the street who are invisible to you until they look like someone you loved. If you want redemption, it's not with me. It's with them. Her voice trembled with pride, with the weight of generations who had carried the same struggle. Richard listened, broken and humbled. He realized she was not asking for him to buy forgiveness. She was demanding that he change, that he turn his power into justice. That night, Richard returned to his mansion, but it no longer felt like home. The paintings, the chandeliers, the marble floors, all of it felt hollow. He stood in the silence and thought of Danielle's words. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, the world began to notice a change. The Langston Foundation redirected billions into education programs, community housing, medical clinics, and scholarships for young black students. Workers at his companies saw wages rise, conditions improved, dignity restored. Richard Langston, the man once known for ruthless ambition, became a man driven by something else, penance. But redemption was not easy. At every step, he remembered Danielle's eyes, the fire, the pain, the strength. He knew he could never undo the years of absence, never erase the scar he had left. All he could do was honor her command, to lift others, to give respect, to use his empire as a tool for healing instead of harm. Danielle continued her life, steady, resilient. She did not seek his fortune, nor his shadow. But sometimes when she passed by a community center bearing her mother's name, funded by the Langston Foundation, she allowed herself a small breath of peace. Not forgiveness, but recognition that her voice had reshaped a legacy. And Richard? He remained haunted. The discovery of Danielle had not saved him, it had broken him. Yet in that breaking, he found something truer than power. He found the humility to see the lives around him, the courage to act, and the understanding that dignity cannot be bought, only honored. Amelia's face still lingered in his dreams. But when he awoke, it was Danielle's voice that guided him. A voice of pain, yes, but also of pride, of strength, of justice. And that voice, more than all his billions, became the measure of his life. Months had turned into a year. The city had changed in ways small and large, though many people never traced the changes back to the moment. Richard Langston met Danielle outside that grocery store. New schools were rising where old, crumbling buildings once stood. Medical clinics now sat at the corners of neighborhoods long neglected. Youth programs filled evenings with music, learning, and laughter instead of silence and fear. The Langston Foundation had poured billions into communities that had lived too long in the shadows. But it wasn't charity, it was responsibility. Richard knew this. He told anyone who would listen that wealth was not his to hoard, but to return to those from whom life had stolen opportunities. And though the world applauded his transformation, though the newspapers wrote stories of a billionaire who had changed, he carried no illusions. He was not a savior. He was a man making amends. One brick, one scholarship, one meal at a time. Danielle, meanwhile, refused to be swept up in his orbit. She remained steady, grounded in her own reality. She still worked, though no longer mopping floors in that same store. She had gone back to school, using a scholarship not from Richard, but one she earned on her own merit. Nights were long, balancing studies with caring for her younger brother, but she endured as she always had, with quiet pride. Yet no matter how far she tried to keep her distance, Richard's presence lingered at the edges of her life. He attended community meetings where she sometimes spoke, sitting quietly in the back, listening more than talking. He never imposed, never claimed her publicly as his daughter, never asked her for acceptance. That restraint was his way of honoring her dignity. One evening, after a town hall meeting about funding a new youth center, Danielle found him standing outside, alone beneath the streetlights. His coat was modest compared to the wealth he once flaunted, and his face was lined with exhaustion, though not from boardroom battles. This was the fatigue of a man who had finally learned what service demanded. "You didn't speak tonight," Danielle said, approaching him carefully. Richard turned, his eyes tired but warm. "It wasn't my place. This community has its own leaders. My job is to listen and to follow their guidance." Danielle studied him, trying to reconcile the man before her with the empire he once represented. She wanted to stay angry, sometimes she still was, but the sincerity in his posture, the humility in his tone softened her resolve. "You've changed," she admitted. "No," Richard said quickly, shaking his head. "I'm changing. Every day, and every day I realize how much more there is to do." They stood in silence for a while, the sounds of the city buzzing faintly around them. Danielle finally spoke, her voice steady. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to call you my father. That word, it means something sacred to me, something you weren't there to give." "I understand," Richard replied quietly. "And I will never ask you to." Her eyes lingered on him, searching. "But I can respect the work you're doing now. Not for me, not for your guilt, but because it matters. That I can acknowledge." For Richard, those words, modest as they were, felt heavier than any award or headline he had ever received. As the months continued, Danielle began to see the ripple effects of her confrontation with him. Her younger brother Marcus, once drifting toward trouble, now spent his evenings at the new community center, learning coding and music production. Families who had once scraped by in silence now spoke of hope, of plans for futures that didn't feel impossible. But there were still those who resisted. Critics accused Richard of trying to buy redemption, of rewriting his legacy with money. Some activists warned against placing trust in a man who had once turned his back. Danielle listened to those voices and in many ways agreed with them. Redemption was not something to be bought. Trust was not given lightly. And yet, she also knew this. His billions were building real opportunities. Opportunities her community desperately needed. If his guilt was the engine, she would not waste the fuel. She would ensure the resources reached the people, not the headlines. In time, Danielle herself began to emerge as a leader. She organized programs, advocated for fair policies, and spoke with the kind of fire that turned heads and opened doors. Reporters began to ask about her connection to Richard Langston, but she always answered the same way. "My life is my own. What matters is the work we do together, not the blood we share." Her words carried a strength that Richard admired from afar. He knew that the greatest gift he could give her was not wealth, but space to grow without his shadow, to shine without his claim. Years later, when Richard grew frail and the weight of age pressed upon him, he called Danielle to his side, not to beg for forgiveness, not to demand recognition, but simply to tell her the truth one last time. "You destroyed me," he whispered, his voice thin. "Not because you hurt me, but because you showed me the man I was, and the man I could never again afford to be. And in destroying me, you gave me something I never thought I'd have again, purpose. For that, I thank you. Whether you accept me or not, know this, I am proud of you. Not because you look like Amelia, not because of blood, but because you are yourself." Danielle listened in silence, her heart a storm of emotions. She did not reach for his hand, nor did she offer the word he longed for. But as she left the room, she paused at the door and said quietly, "Keep the work going even when you're gone. That's what will matter." And when Richard Langston passed, the empire he left behind was not remembered for its ruthless acquisitions or gleaming towers. It was remembered for the communities it rebuilt, the dignity it restored, and the lives it uplifted. His name became less important than the legacy of justice his resources fueled. Danielle stood at the edge of the crowd during his memorial, her face unreadable. She did not claim him, nor did she disown him. She simply carried forward the work, her voice louder, her presence stronger, her pride unshaken.
Because in the end,
This was never a story about a billionaire saving a community. It was a story about a woman who confronted him with truth, who demanded respect, and who showed the world that dignity cannot be denied, even by those who try to erase it. And though Richard Langston had once been destroyed by that truth, in his destruction lay the beginning of something greater than wealth, justice. Years passed after Richard Langston's funeral. The empire he left behind no longer bore the shine of unchecked greed. Instead, it became something different, something unexpected. The boardrooms were still there. The skyscrapers still stretched into the clouds. But the Langston Foundation was no longer a vanity project. It had become an engine of justice, run by people who had grown up in the very neighborhoods once ignored. At the center of this change was Danielle. Not by choice at first. She resisted stepping into the spotlight, insisting that her life belonged to herself, not to her connection with Richard. But fate, as always, had other plans. It began when Marcus, her younger brother, stood before a crowd at the opening of a new youth technology center. Cameras flashed, journalists scribbled, and the mayor gave his rehearsed speech. But when Marcus spoke, his words carried the raw truth of lived experience. He spoke of hunger, of resilience, of second chances. He spoke of the sister who had raised him, the woman who had been both protector and guide. And in that moment, all eyes turned to Danielle. She could not hide anymore. She was no longer just a woman who looked like a missing daughter. She was a leader. Danielle's voice grew louder in the years that followed. She organized marches, challenged discriminatory policies, and fought for workers' rights within Richard's companies. Where Richard once commanded respect through fear, Danielle earned it through courage. Her speeches carried the weight of generations silenced. Her actions sparked movements across the city. And yet, she never claimed Richard as her father, not in public, not in private. When asked about him, she always replied the same. I am the daughter of a woman who gave everything to raise me. My strength comes from her. My purpose comes from my people. If Richard Langston's legacy has changed, it's not because of who he was, it's because of who we demanded he become. Those words became a kind of anthem. Repeated at rallies, etched into murals on city walls, Danielle had transformed pain into power, grief into leadership. But with recognition came opposition. Wealthy elites who had once praised Richard for his philanthropy grew restless under Danielle's influence. They whispered that she was radical, too demanding, ungrateful. Politicians accused her of trying to dismantle the very structures that funded her programs. Some even attempted to smear her, digging into her past, twisting her story. Danielle faced it all with unflinching resolve. You cannot shame me for surviving, she told them at a press conference. You cannot weaponize the struggles I've endured, because those struggles are what made me strong. If you want to fight me, then fight me, but know that I do not stand alone. And she didn't. Communities rallied around her. Workers marched beside her. Students carried her words on protest signs. Even those who once doubted her now saw in her a leader they could trust, not because she sought power, but because she demanded dignity. In quiet moments, Danielle thought of Richard. She wondered what he would think of the battles she now fought, the empire he had left behind, reshaped in ways he might never have imagined. Sometimes she felt his presence, not as a father, but as a shadow of history reminding her of what had been and what must never be repeated. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Danielle sat on the steps of the very grocery store where she and Richard had first spoken years ago. The store had been renovated, brighter now, with fair wages and benefits for its workers. She looked at the windows. She had once cleaned and thought of the girl she had been, tired, overlooked, yet still standing tall. That girl had not disappeared. She was still here, guiding her every choice. Marcus joined her, placing a soda in her hand. You ever think about how wild this all is? He asked, smiling. From mopping floors to leading movements? Danielle chuckled softly. Every day. But you know what? None of this feels like it's about me. It's about us. About every person who was told they were invisible. Every voice that was silenced. I just happened to be the one carrying the microphone. Marcus nodded, his pride obvious. Mom would be proud. Danielle's eyes glistened. Their mother had passed quietly a few years earlier, never fully revealing her history with Richard, never explaining why she had chosen silence. Danielle no longer needed the answers. Her mother's sacrifices spoke louder than any explanation could. The years rolled on. Danielle became not just a local figure, but a national voice. She testified before Congress about corporate accountability. She advised mayors on equitable development. And she helped craft laws that gave workers more power, Some called her relentless. Others called her dangerous. But those who knew her best called her necessary. And through it all, she never allowed herself to forget the lesson that began on that rainy evening years ago, that dignity is not given by wealth, and justice does not come from power, it comes from truth. When Danielle finally stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, accepting an award for her community leadership, she spoke not of herself, not of her father, but of her people. "This story was never about me," she said firmly, her voice echoing through the hall. "It was never about a billionaire who changed his ways. It is about us, about every black worker, every mother who sacrifices, every child who dreams despite the weight of the world pressing down. I am here because of them, and everything I do will be for them." The crowd rose to its feet, applause thundering, tears streaming down the faces of many. In that moment, Danielle knew she had completed the circle. She was no longer simply a mirror of a missing daughter. She was no longer the scar of Richard's hidden past. She was her own story, powerful, dignified, unshakable. And though Richard Langston had once been destroyed by discovering her, Danielle had risen from that destruction. Not as a shadow, but as a light no one could ever extinguish. Decades later, the city looked different. Where boarded-up buildings once sagged, new schools and community centers stood tall. Where families once struggled in silence, voices now rang out in classrooms, libraries, and meeting halls. Murals painted across brick walls told stories not of billionaires, but of resilience, faces of mothers, workers, children, and activists who had demanded more. And among those murals was one of Danielle. Her likeness, captured in bold strokes of color, stretched across the side of the community center, named after her mother. The caption read, "Dignity is not given, it is claimed." Danielle herself had passed years earlier, her funeral attended by thousands. Leaders, workers, children she had mentored, neighbors she had fought beside, all came to honor her life. She was buried not in a private estate or a lavish cemetery, but in the same community where she had once mopped floors, the same streets where her voice had first risen. For her, resting among her people was the only honor that mattered. Her brother Marcus carried her legacy forward. He became an educator, running the very youth center that had once given him direction. Each morning he told the children who walked through the doors, "You matter. Your dreams matter. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." And when they asked about the woman in the mural, he told them the truth. "She was my sister. She taught me that dignity is worth more than gold. She taught me that silence can be broken. And she taught me that justice is not a gift, it's a fight." But Danielle's story reached even further. Universities began to study her life, not because she was the daughter of Richard Langston, but because of the movements she ignited. Historians wrote about her speeches, activists cited her words, and her philosophy of dignity as the foundation of justice became part of curricula across the nation. The irony, of course, was not lost on anyone. Richard Langston, once remembered as a titan of industry, now appeared in history, books only as a shadow in Danielle's story. The man whose power collapsed when confronted with truth. His name, once towering, was now a footnote. Danielle's once ignored had become a torch. Generations later, children born long after her passing recited her words at rallies. Workers painted her face on picket signs. Young girls looked to her life as proof that they were never invisible. Her story became legend, not because she was perfect, but because she was relentless. One such child, a young girl named Nia, sat cross-legged in her classroom, staring at the mural of Danielle printed in her textbook. She was assigned to write an essay about a figure who inspired her. While other students chose presidents or inventors, Nia chose Danielle. She wrote, "Danielle was not born rich. She was not given power. She was told she was invisible, but she refused to believe it. She spoke the truth so loud that even a billionaire had to listen. She showed us that dignity is not about who your father is or how much money you have. Dignity is about knowing your worth and never letting anyone take it away. I want to live like that. I want to be like her." Her teacher, wiping tears from her eyes, pinned the essay on the classroom wall. And so Danielle's story lived on, not in monuments or bank accounts, but in the hearts of children who carried her fire forward. The community she once fought for continued to grow, to thrive, to demand more from the world. The empire Richard Langston had built was long gone, its steel towers replaced by institutions bearing the names of mothers, workers and activists whose lives had fueled the struggle for justice. In the end, the question was never about Richard, never about his billions. It was about the truth Danielle had spoken to him on that rainy evening years ago. If you want redemption, it's not with me. It's with them. That truth outlived them both. It became a creed, a movement, a legacy carved into the fabric of a city, a people, a history that refused to be erased. And so the story of Danielle, the woman who looked like a missing daughter, was no longer defined by resemblance or bloodline. She was defined by the dignity she carried, the justice she demanded, and the generations she inspired. For in the end, what destroys one man can rebuild a people. And what began as a billionaire's shame became a nation's light. Years passed, and the city Danielle once called home had transformed again. Neon lights now reflected in glass, towers that stretched higher than Richard Langston's ever had. Technology hummed everywhere, phones, cameras, drones hovering over streets. The world was more connected, yet in many ways more divided than ever. Nia, now grown, walked through the same community center where her essay on Danielle had once been pinned to the wall. She was taller, sharper, carrying a laptop bag over her shoulder instead of a backpack. She had become a journalist, one unafraid of asking hard questions, one who saw truth-telling not just as a profession, but as an inheritance. Every morning she stood before the mural of Danielle on the center's wall. Dignity is not given. It is claimed. The words stared back at her, reminding her that the fight wasn't over. In some ways, it had only changed form. Corporations now controlled more than factories. They controlled data, the new gold of the world. Nia's investigations revealed how tech companies harvested information from poor, Black communities, exploiting them not with whips or mop buckets, but with algorithms that decided who got a loan, who was hired, who was policed. The injustice was quieter now, hidden behind screens and coded in numbers, but it was just as devastating. One evening while preparing an exposé, Nia discovered a familiar name buried in her research, Langston Innovations, a tech conglomerate built not by Richard himself but by his descendants, now rebranded as visionaries. They sponsored charities, funded scholarships, and plastered their name across billboards promising equity through innovation. But behind the polished image, Nia saw patterns. Black neighborhoods denied housing through automated credit scoring. Workers fired by algorithms that judged them as unproductive. Police. Drones disproportionately, circling low-income districts. It was the same old story, power dressing itself in new clothes, discrimination encoded in machines. When Nia published her first article exposing Langston Innovations, the backlash was immediate. Emails flooded her inbox, some praising her courage, others threatening her life. Executives dismissed her as misinformed. Television pundits called her too emotional, and legal notices arrived, demanding she retract her story. But Nia did not back down. She remembered Danielle, her voice ringing against the storm, her defiance in the face of Richard Langston's billions. She carried that memory like armor. So she went further. She interviewed laid-off workers, mothers whose families were denied housing, fathers wrongly flagged by facial recognition. She turned their stories into evidence, their pain into testimony. And just as Danielle had once declared dignity for the working poor, Nia declared dignity for the digitally oppressed. The movement grew. Protests surged not outside factories this time, but outside data centers. Placards read, "We are not data. We are human." And at the front of those marches, Nia held her head high, echoing Danielle's legacy in a world that desperately needed to hear it again. The Langston heirs tried to silence her. They offered settlements, hush money, even positions of influence. "Work with us," they pleaded. "You can help us from the inside." But Nia, remembering Danielle's refusal to accept Richard's power, stood firm. "I will not be bought," she told them. "Dignity cannot be coded. Justice cannot be negotiated." The fight stretched on for years. Court battles, public campaigns, late nights drafting stories that shook entire industries. Nia sacrificed comfort, even relationships, to carry the work forward. But she also gained something deeper, a community that stood with her. A generation of young activists, coders, and educators who believed that justice in the digital age was possible. And in quiet moments when exhaustion threatened to break her, she visited Danielle's grave. She would kneel, place her hand on the stone, and whisper, "I am still carrying it. Your fire hasn't gone out." One day, while speaking at a global summit on ethics and technology, Nia stood before a crowd of world leaders. Cameras flashed, microphones leaned forward, and the weight of history pressed on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, then began. "My name is Nia Carter. I come from a city where a woman once told the world that dignity is not given, it is claimed. Her name was Danielle. She was a worker, a sister, a daughter, and a leader. She faced a billionaire who thought he could erase her. But instead, she erased him from history. Today, her fight continues through us. Our struggle is no longer just about wages or housing. It is about our humanity being reduced to lines of code. It is about algorithms deciding who belongs and who does not. It is about machines learning prejudice faster than they learn compassion. And I am here to tell you, we will not be erased, not by poverty, not by power, not by technology. We are more than data points. We are human. And our dignity cannot be programmed away. The hall erupted. Some clapped, some cried, and others sat in silence, confronted by the undeniable truth of her words. Nia had become what Danielle once was, the voice that refused to be silenced. And so Danielle's legacy lived on, not frozen in the past, but reborn in every generation that faced injustice. Where Richard Langston's empire had withered into dust, Danielle's fire kept burning, carried by those who refused to let the world forget. For dignity once claimed can never be returned. It only multiplies, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation, until the world finally learns to see. Time has a way of softening monuments and fading names. But there are some truths that refuse to die. Danielle's story was one of them. It had begun with silence, with a mop in her hand and eyes cast downward. It had grown into defiance, a voice that shattered a billionaire's illusion of power. And it had stretched across generations, carried like a sacred flame by those who refused to bow. Nia's battles against digital oppression turned into victories, not overnight, not without scars, but victories nonetheless. Laws were passed ensuring transparency in algorithms. Rights of the digitally vulnerable were recognized, and communities once targeted began to hold the tools of technology in their own hands. Yet even these changes were not the end. They were only another chapter, another step in a much longer journey. For every Danielle, there would always be another Richard. Power, in its many disguises, would always seek to erase, to control, to silence. And for every Richard, there would be another voice rising from the margins, carrying the same unyielding truth. Dignity is not a privilege. It is a birthright. Years later, when Nia too grew older, she would sit on the steps of the community center. Children gathered at her feet. They did not know Richard Langston's name. They did not care for the memory of billionaires who thought themselves immortal, but they leaned forward when Nia spoke of Danielle. She wasn't famous, Nia would tell them. She wasn't rich. She was a woman who worked, who loved her family, who demanded to be seen. And when she looked power in the eye, she did not tremble. That is why you know her name today. That is why you see her face painted on the walls. Because she claimed her dignity, and in doing so she taught us all to claim ours. The children would listen, wide-eyed, some too young to understand fully, but all sensing that they were hearing something sacred. And as they grew, they carried those words with them, repeating them in classrooms, in protests, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, wherever their voices were needed. Danielle's fire had become something larger than any one person. It was no longer about a daughter missing or a billionaire broken. It was about a truth rooted deep in the soil of history, watered by centuries of struggle, blooming in every generation that dared to believe in justice. Her story spread far beyond the city. Across oceans, activists spoke her name. In Africa, her image was carried at marches against economic exploitation. In Europe, her words were quoted in parliaments debating digital rights. In the Caribbean, her legacy was taught alongside freedom fighters who had resisted centuries of oppression. Danielle had become more than a woman. She had become a symbol of humanity's refusal to be erased. And still, the world changed. New technologies emerged. New systems of power tried to disguise themselves as progress. But each time, someone remembered Danielle. Someone whispered her words. Someone carried her flame into the fight. Centuries later, when the world had transformed into something almost unrecognizable, when people traveled through stars, when machines walked among humans, when the boundaries of nations blurred, Danielle's story was still told. Not in the language of one people, but in many tongues, across many lands. She was no longer simply a woman who had faced a billionaire. She was the living testament that dignity could never be bought, stolen, or erased. Her name had entered myth, but her lesson remained human. And in that future, a young girl, her hair braided, her eyes fierce, opened an old digital archive and found a recording of Nia's speech. She listened, transfixed, as Nia declared to the world that dignity could not be coded away. She listened, and in her heart she felt something awaken. She closed the archive and whispered to herself, "It's my turn now." And so it continued. For in the end, Danielle's life was never about beginnings or endings. It was about a cycle. A flame passed forward, generation after generation, until the world finally understood. What destroyed Richard Langston was not Danielle's resemblance to his missing daughter. It was the truth she embodied, that wealth could build towers, but it could not erase injustice. That power could silence voices for a time, but it could never bury dignity forever. And what rebuilt the people, the city, and the world was Danielle's refusal to be unseen. Her legacy was not etched in marble, but in living hearts. Not secured in vaults, but in classrooms, in streets, in whispered promises of children who swore they would not let the flame die. Danielle was gone, yet Danielle was everywhere. Her dignity lived on. Her courage lived on. Her fire lived on. And long after her name was first spoken, it still burned across time as a truth the world could never unlearn. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. Centuries had passed. Cities glittered like constellations across the earth, and humanity had spread beyond its cradle, reaching into the stars. Colonies floated in orbit, carved into asteroids, built upon distant moons. Technology had advanced beyond imagination, diseases cured, hunger diminished, lifespans stretched. Yet even in this new age where machines and humans walked side by side, the old struggles found new forms. Power still gathered in the hands of a few. Exploitation still shifted shape but never vanished. Some voices were amplified by technology, while others were silenced by it. And through it all, the name Danielle still survived. Her story, once whispered in community centers and classrooms, was now etched into the cultural memory of humankind. Her face was not carved into stone statues, but projected in holograms, painted on the sides of starships, embedded in the archives of every colony. To some she was history, to others she was scripture. On the mining colony of Vesta 3, a young boy named Amari walked through the workers' quarters, clutching a digital slate. His family, like many others, lived under the control of a corporate syndicate that owned not only the mines but the workers' lives. Wages were low, hours long, and conditions harsh. The corporation promised freedom, but freedom never came. Amari's slate held a recording, a speech by Danielle from long ago, preserved and carried across centuries. The hologram flickered as her voice filled the cramped quarters. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. The word struck him like a revelation. Here, among the dust and steel of a foreign rock, he felt as though she were speaking directly to him. And for the first time, Amari believed his life could mean more than servitude. He began to share her words with others. Miners exhausted after 18-hour shifts. Mothers raising children in airless domes. Elders who had lost hope of ever returning to Earth. Slowly, Danielle's message spread across Vesta 3. Her story was retold, reshaped, made their own. She was one of us, they whispered. She fought against the powerful and refused to be erased. We can do the same, the corporation noticed. Supervisors issued warnings, security drones hovered closer, and propaganda messages flooded the networks. But by then it was too late. Danielle's fire had already taken root. When the first strike erupted on Vesta 3, the workers carried no weapons. They carried Danielle's words, painted on banners that floated through the airlocks. We are not expendable. We are human. The syndicate tried to crush them. They cut off supplies, shut down oxygen regulators, and threatened deportation. But the workers held fast. Amari stood at the front, his voice trembling but unwavering as he repeated Danielle's creed. And then something unexpected happened. Other colonies heard. Workers on Mars, technicians in orbital stations, nurses on Europa, all saw the strike on Vesta 3 and recognized themselves in the struggle. Across the solar system, people began to echo the same words. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. It became a movement greater than any corporation, stronger than any syndicate, a movement rooted not in technology but in humanity. Years later, when historians asked where it began, they did not credit Amari or even Vesta 3. They reached back further, tracing the fire through centuries, through Nia, through the protests of the digital age, through Danielle's confrontation with Richard Langston. They called it the lineage of fire. And in classrooms on Earth and colonies beyond, children recited its origin. A woman once told a billionaire that dignity could not be bought. And from that truth, generations found their strength. The Langston name had long vanished, Their towers had crumbled, their companies dissolved, their wealth scattered like dust. But Danielle's words had endured, not bound by bloodlines or inheritance, but by the stubborn persistence of truth. And so, long after Earth's billionaires were forgotten, her voice still rose, carried into the far reaches of space. For every new world humanity touched, every new injustice that emerged, there was always someone who remembered Danielle, always someone who whispered her words, always someone who passed the fire forward. Because what she had taught was eternal. Power can change shape. Systems can disguise themselves. But dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken away. It only spreads. There came a time, after centuries of struggle, after countless voices rose and countless battles were fought, when humanity finally understood. Not all at once, not without setbacks, not without pain, but slowly, relentlessly. The truth, Danielle had spoken, spread until it was no longer a demand shouted in the streets. It became the very fabric of society. On Earth, the city where Danielle had once mopped floors was unrecognizable. No longer divided by poverty and towers of wealth, it had become a place where every child was given the same start, where justice was not a courtroom gamble but a daily practice. The mural of Danielle still remained on the community center wall, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of the foundation on which the present was built. Across the stars, in colonies once ruled by syndicates, people lived freely. The systems that had once reduced humans to labor or data had been dismantled, replaced by councils where workers, educators, and caregivers held as much authority as scientists and leaders. Technology no longer exploited, it served. Algorithms were no longer silent gatekeepers. They were tools of equity, designed transparently, accountable to the people. The lineage of fire, as historians called it, had achieved what seemed impossible. Dignity was no longer something to fight for. It was assumed, protected, cherished, and yet Danielle's story was still told. Parents whispered it to their children at bedtime. Teachers wove it into lessons, poets carried it into song. They told of a woman who was overlooked, who was mistaken for someone she was not, who was told her life had no weight. They told how she had stood unflinching before a billionaire and declared that her dignity was not his to define. Generations later, those words were no longer a battle cry. They were a truth so ingrained that children could hardly imagine a world without them. And yet, when they heard the story, their eyes still widened in disbelief. Did people really live like that? They asked. Yes, their elders answered. And because one woman refused to bow, we never will again. In the capital of a united earth, a monument stood, not of stone or steel, but of light, a holographic flame, flickering eternal. At its base were inscribed the names not of leaders or billionaires, but of ordinary people who had carried the fire forward. Workers, mothers, children, activists, teachers, each name woven into the lineage of dignity. And at the very center, one name glowed brightest: Danielle Carter. No longer remembered as the daughter who resembled wealth, no longer defined by the billionaire who once tried to erase her. Danielle lived in memory as she had lived in life, a woman who claimed her dignity and gave others the courage to claim theirs. On the anniversary of her stand, people gathered before the flame of light. Children held candles, elders told stories, and voices rose together in song. And though centuries separated them from her lifetime, they felt her presence among them. For Danielle had never been just one woman. She had been the seed of a truth that could not die. That night, as the crowd dispersed and the stars glittered overhead, a little girl tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa," she asked softly, "why do we still say her name if the fight is already won?" Her father knelt, smiling, his eyes reflecting the eternal flame. "Because dignity is not something you win once," he told her. "It's something you must remember every day." Her name reminds us of that. As long as we speak it, we will never forget. The girl nodded, holding the candle close to her chest. And as she looked at the flame, she whispered Danielle's name, as countless voices had whispered before her, as countless voices would whisper after. In that whisper, the fire lived on. And so it ended, not with destruction, not with despair, but with a world rebuilt, on the truth that had once destroyed a billionaire and uplifted humanity. Dignity is not given, it is claimed. Forever.